The phone rings at 1:17 in the morning. It rings again, again, then a woman's voice, raw and unraveling. The kind of voice that only comes from someone standing at the edge of a fear they cannot name yet, breaks through the static of a 911 recording that investigators would later describe as one of the most distressing calls they had ever received. My daughter never came home. She always answers her phone. She always answers, "Please, something is wrong. Something is wrong." That call came from Linda Vaughn, and the daughter she was calling about was Emily. Emily Vaughn, 26 years old, a dental assistant who drove a silver Honda Civic and kept a vegetable garden and texted her mother every single night before bed, without fail, without exception, for the past 4 years. That night, the text never came, and Emily never came home. What investigators initially believed was a straightforward missing persons case would unravel over the following weeks into something far darker, far more calculated, and far more disturbing than anyone in the quiet suburb of Millhaven could have imagined. Because the man responsible for Emily's disappearance wasn't hiding in the shadows. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't someone who lived at the edges of normal life, someone you might have looked at twice on the street and felt something shift inside you. He was standing right beside the search parties, handing out flyers with Emily's face on them, organizing grid maps for volunteer searchers, comforting grieving families, shaking detectives' hands. And he had been doing it with other victims in other towns, in other tragedies, for nearly a decade. This is the story of how he was finally stopped. And it starts, as so many of the worst stories do, with a perfectly ordinary Friday night. Emily Vaughn was, by every account, one of those people who made the people around her feel steadier just by being in the room. Her coworkers at Riverside Dental described her the way people describe someone who is genuinely, quietly good, not performatively kind, not trying to be liked, just someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that paying attention to other people was worth doing. She remembered everyone's coffee order. She stayed late to help close up without being asked. She sent handwritten birthday cards in an age when most people barely managed to text. She kept a running mental inventory of which of her coworkers was going through something hard, and she checked in on them. Not obtrusively, just enough. She had moved to Millhaven 3 years earlier for the job, leaving her hometown of Briar Creek about 90 miles south. She rented a small house on Cedarwood Lane, a tidy, quiet residential street with mature oaks lining the sidewalk and neighbors who waved from driveways. She set up her vegetable garden in the first spring, grew tomatoes and basil and one ambitious zucchini plant that got completely out of control by August. She called her mother every Sunday without exception. She had a small circle of friends, a gym she went to 3 mornings a week, a coffee shop she considered hers. She was not the kind of person who disappeared. She was the kind of person who made sure other people knew they mattered. She was meticulous and routine-oriented and deeply, fundamentally connected to the people she loved. Her mother, Linda, told investigators that Emily had a ritual she had kept since moving to Millhaven. Every night, without exception, she would send a text before bed. Sometimes it was long, a recap of her day, something funny that happened at work, a question about the garden at her childhood home that Linda still maintained. Sometimes it was just a single emoji, a sunflower, a moon, something small that said, "I'm here, I'm okay, I'm thinking of you." For years, roughly 1,400 nights, not once had that text failed to arrive. So when Linda's phone showed nothing by midnight on October 4th, she didn't wait. She called. Voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She texted. No response. She called Emily's coworker Pam, whose number she had for emergencies, and Pam, still awake, still half-dressed from the evening out, told her they had all left the tap room hours ago, and Emily had seemed fine, just a little quiet, and had said good night and walked out. Linda got in her car at 12:49 a.m. She drove 90 miles in the dark. She filed the 911 call from a gas station parking lot 40 minutes outside Millhaven, because she could not wait until she arrived. Which is why, when Linda Vaughn did not receive her daughter's nightly text on the evening of October 4th, she knew within minutes that something was wrong. On that Friday evening, Emily had joined a small group of coworkers at a sports bar called the Tap Room to celebrate a colleague's birthday. She arrived around 8. She ordered a diet soda. She wasn't much of a drinker, found a seat near the end of the table, and by most accounts seemed perfectly fine for the first hour or so. She laughed at a few things. She asked questions about the birthday girl's new apartment. She was present in the way that Emily always was. A coworker named Dina Rashid, who sat directly across from Emily that evening, told investigators something that had stayed with her since the night it happened. She said that around 9 o'clock, Emily had excused herself to use the restroom and been gone for almost 10 minutes. When she came back, she seemed different. Not dramatically different. Not the kind of shift you would notice if you weren't paying close attention. But Dina had been watching for her to come back because she wanted to finish a story she'd been telling, and so she noticed. Emily sat down, picked up her glass, and spent several seconds just looking at the table in front of her, like someone resetting, like someone who had just made a decision about something and was now living in the first moments after making it. But sometime around 10 o'clock, something shifted. A bartender named Marcus Webb later told investigators that he had been restocking glasses behind the bar when he noticed Emily at the table. She had her phone in her hand and was reading something on the screen, reading it carefully, not scrolling, actually reading. And her face had changed. The easiest way Marcus could describe it, he said, was that she looked like someone who had just understood something they had been trying not to understand. She went still, Marcus said. Like, not frozen. Just very still. And then she put her phone face down on the table and kind of looked around the bar. Not at her friends. Around the bar. She kept looking at the door, he continued. Not like she was waiting for someone. More like she was checking to make sure someone wasn't coming in. Around 11:40 p.m., Emily told her coworkers she was heading home. She seemed tired, they said. A little distracted. When one coworker, a woman named Pam Diaz, offered to call her a ride, Emily said she was fine, she'd figure it out. She hugged a few people, grabbed her jacket, and walked out into the cool October night. That was the last time any of them saw her. Her car, a silver Honda Civic, was found still parked in the tap room's lot the following morning. The doors were locked. Her purse was on the passenger seat. Her phone was off, completely powered down, which was entirely unlike her. Her bank cards showed no activity after 9 p.m. There was no note, no voicemail, no text to anyone explaining where she was going. No indication of where she had gone or why she had left without her car, without her purse, without any of the things that anchored her to her own life. When Linda Vaughn arrived at the Millhaven Police Department the morning after her 911 call, she had driven 90 miles in the dark after not sleeping. She sat down across from Detective Ray Callahan, a 16-year veteran of the department, methodical and experienced and not easily rattled. And she looked at him with the expression of a woman who had already decided she would not be patronized. And she said, "My daughter did not leave voluntarily. I don't care what it looks like. I know my daughter. She texted me every night. Every single night for 4 years. She did not walk away from her life." Callahan was careful in his response. He was honest with her. In his experience, missing adults, especially young women in their 20s, often turned up within 48 hours. A fight with a partner no one knew about. A need to disappear quietly for a few days. An impulsive decision that looked alarming from the outside but resolved itself quickly. He had seen it before, many times. But something about Linda Vaughn's certainty was not the kind that came from panic. It was the kind that came from knowing someone. And something about the locked car with the purse still inside, and the phone that had been deliberately powered down, not drained, deliberately powered down, made Callahan uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite articulate yet. He opened the case as a priority missing persons investigation. And then, 17 hours later, everything changed. The traffic camera footage was found almost by accident. Detective Priya Santos, 3 years on the job, methodical, with a talent for surveillance review that her colleagues had noticed early, had been tasked with pulling footage from the surrounding blocks near the taproom. It was standard procedure. Most of the cameras were angled towards storefronts or parking lots and captured nothing useful. A few showed the front of the bar from different angles, and in all of them, Emily's exit at 11:40 p.m. was visible. She pushed through the front door, turned left, and walked out of frame. But one camera, mounted on a traffic light at the corner of Grover and Elm, 2 blocks from the tap room, told a different story entirely. At 11:52 p.m., the footage clearly showed Emily Vaughn walking along the sidewalk. She had her arms crossed and her head slightly down. She paused at the corner, not the pause of someone who wasn't sure which way to go, but the pause of someone who had stopped to think. And then a dark SUV, traveling slowly, pulled to the curb beside her. The footage was grainy, the way most traffic cameras are, but it was clear enough to see Emily lean toward the passenger window. A brief exchange, 15, maybe 20 seconds. Then she opened the door and got in. The interior light blinked on for a moment as the door opened, and the footage captured, just barely, the profile of a driver. The SUV pulled away from the curb and drove west on Elm. Emily Vaughn was never seen again. Detective Callahan reviewed the footage 3 times in silence before he said anything. Santos stood beside him, watching the same 12 seconds loop over and over. Finally, Callahan turned to her and said, very quietly, "Get me that plate." It took 40 minutes. The vehicle, a dark Chevrolet Tahoe, 2019, was registered to a man named Nathan Mercer, 42 years old, married, 2 daughters, employed as a mid-level logistics coordinator for a regional distribution company called Paramount Freight. No criminal record, not a single prior contact with law enforcement, not even a speeding ticket in the past 6 years. He lived on Cedarwood Lane, the same street as Emily Vaughn. For houses down. Santos read that last detail out loud, and Callahan didn't respond immediately. He just sat back in his chair and looked at the paused image of Nathan Mercer's SUV on his screen. For houses down. The same street. A neighbor. The following morning, Callahan and Santos drove to the Mercer home. It was a well-kept colonial with dark green shutters and a tidy front lawn that had been recently raked. A child's bicycle leaned against the side of the garage. There was a potted mum on the front porch, orange and full. Nathan Mercer answered the door in a gray fleece pullover and dark jeans, holding a mug of coffee. He was broadly built, with close-cut brown hair going slightly gray at the temples and an open, pleasant face. He smiled and invited them in without hesitation. His wife, Diane, appeared briefly from the kitchen doorway, mid-40s, neatly dressed, arms crossed in that way people stand when they're trying to seem casual and are not quite managing it, before retreating back into the kitchen. They sat in the living room. It was a normal, comfortable room. Family photographs on the walls. A child's drawing framed above the bookcase. A bowl of apples on the coffee table. Callahan explained that they were following up on the disappearance of Nathan's neighbor, Emily Vaughn, and asked whether Nathan knew her. Nathan nodded, his expression settling into something that looked like appropriate concern. "Sure. I know her to wave to. We've said hello a few times. She came to one of our block cookouts last summer, I think. Really nice girl." He paused. "Have you found her? Is she okay?" Callahan said the investigation was ongoing. He asked Nathan to walk him through his Friday evening. Nathan said he had been home all night. He and Diane had watched a movie after the kids went to bed. He thought it was something on Netflix. He couldn't remember the title exactly. They'd gone to bed around 11. A quiet night. Callahan nodded. "So you weren't near the tap room at any point that evening?" "No," Nathan said. He shook his head. "I wasn't anywhere near that part of town." Callahan reached into the folder he'd brought and set a printed still from the traffic camera footage on the coffee table between them. It showed, clearly, the dark Tahoe pulled up to the curb on Elm Street. The timestamp read 11:52 p.m. Nathan Mercer looked at the photograph. What happened next was the moment that Santos would describe in every subsequent interview, and eventually in court testimony, as the thing she kept coming back to. Not what Nathan said. How long it took him to say it. 7 seconds. She counted them. Not dramatically, not as a deliberate exercise. She just found herself counting because something about those 7 seconds felt like they had weight. Nathan's expression during those 7 seconds did not collapse. It did not flash with panic or guilt or the specific, recognizable micro-expression of someone who has just been caught. It simply paused, like a program processing, like a man running through options with the cool efficiency of someone who had thought about this kind of moment before, had perhaps even prepared for it, and was now selecting the most appropriate response from a prepared list. "Oh," he said finally. "Right. She did ask me for a ride." And then, smoothly, without hesitation, he produced an explanation. He had gone out briefly that night. He'd forgotten to mention it, to pick up a prescription from a 24-hour pharmacy. He drove past Emily on the corner, recognized her from the neighborhood, and offered her a lift since she lived nearby. She got in. He dropped her at the corner of Cedarwood Lane. She thanked him, said good night, and walked toward her house. He watched her go, then drove home himself. It was such a complete, reasonable-sounding account. Each detail just specific enough to seem credible, just vague enough to avoid easy verification. Callahan asked why. When Emily's disappearance was reported in the news the following morning, Nathan hadn't immediately contacted police to let them know he'd given her a ride. Nathan looked mildly surprised by the question, as if it hadn't occurred to him. "Honestly, I figured she'd gotten home fine. She seemed perfectly okay when I dropped her off. I didn't connect it." Callahan thanked him and said they might have follow-up questions. Nathan said, of course, whatever he could do to help. In the car, pulling away from the Mercer house, Santos looked straight ahead through the windshield and said, "He never asked if she was okay." Callahan glanced at her. "When you first told him we were investigating her disappearance," Santos said. "He asked, right at the beginning, 'Have you found her? Is she okay?' But the moment he had an explanation to give, the moment he had a story that put him in control of the narrative, he never asked about her again. Not once. Not whether she'd been found. Not whether the family was doing all right." She paused. Everything was about explaining himself. Nothing was about her. Callahan didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Pull his phone records." The pharmacy story fell apart within 36 hours. The credit card charge at the 24-hour pharmacy was real. Nathan had made a purchase at 11:38 p.m., but the pharmacy was located on the north side of Millhaven. The traffic camera on Grover and Elm was on the southwest side. The distance between those 2 points and the direction of travel required to get from one to the other did not match the route you would take if you were going home after picking up a prescription. You would have to go significantly out of your way to pass that corner. 14 minutes out of your way, specifically. 14 minutes that Nathan had not accounted for. And then came the GPS data, obtained via warrant. Nathan's phone's location history for the night of October 4th painted a picture that bore no resemblance to the story he had told. After the pharmacy, his phone did not travel northeast towards Cedarwood Lane. It traveled southeast, toward the edge of Millhaven where the residential streets thinned out and gave way to rural highway, industrial lots, and long stretches of dark road with no cameras and very few witnesses. The phone's GPS went dormant at 12:09 a.m. Not powered down, dormant, in a specific, localized way that suggested it had been placed inside something that blocked signal. A bag, investigators believed, or a box. It reactivated at 1:44 a.m., then traveled directly home. Nathan Mercer's story was not just inconsistent. It was a fabrication constructed with enough plausible detail to sound credible and containing just enough truth. The pharmacy receipt, the acknowledgement of giving Emily a ride, to create the impression of honesty. But there was something else. Something that Callahan found when he went looking through the media coverage of Emily's disappearance and experienced the kind of cold, creeping recognition that he would later struggle to describe accurately in interviews. In the background of a local news segment filmed at the Volunteer Search Coordination Point, filmed exactly 48 hours after Emily vanished, there was Nathan Mercer. He was wearing a high-visibility orange vest. He was holding a clipboard. He was talking to a group of volunteers with the calm, organized demeanor of someone who had done this before, explaining how the grid search areas had been divided, where each group should start, how to document what they found. He had inserted himself into the search for Emily Vaughn within 2 days of her disappearance. Callahan sat with that for a long moment. Then, on an instinct he couldn't fully explain, he pulled up archived news footage from a case he vaguely remembered from 6 years earlier. A woman named Carla Simmons, 28 years old, a nurse who had disappeared after leaving a late-night shift in a town called Harwick, 40 minutes east of Millhaven. She had never been found. The case had gone cold 18 months in and stayed cold. He searched through the Harwick archived footage until he found what he was looking for. A volunteer search briefing held 9 days after Carla Simmons disappeared. The footage was low resolution, shot on a local news camera in 2018, and the man he was looking at was partly obscured by other people in the frame. He was standing slightly to the left of the main group, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the briefing coordinator with attentive, focused eyes. It took Callahan over an hour to be sure enough to act on it. He sent the frame to the department's digital forensics unit and asked for an enhancement and a facial comparison against Nathan Mercer's DMV photograph. 22 hours later, the comparison came back. The man in the Harwick footage was Nathan Mercer. If this story is gripping you, and we know it is, take 5 seconds right now and hit subscribe. We tell these stories every week, and we need your support to keep doing it. Now stay with us, because what investigators uncovered next changed the entire scope of what they were dealing with. The investigation that followed was one of the most methodical and quietly devastating in the region's recent history. Callahan brought in the State Police Cold Case Unit and assembled a cross-jurisdictional task force that began cross-referencing Nathan Mercer's known movements, his work travel records, his social media activity, his phone's GPS history going back as far as the carrier retained data, against unsolved disappearances across a 4-county radius spanning the past 9 years. What they found was not a neat, obvious pattern. Nathan had been careful in ways that suggested he had thought seriously about how investigations worked. He was never directly linked to most of the other cases. There were no obvious fingerprints, no direct witness accounts, no receipts that put him at a scene. But he overlapped with the cases. Loosely, subtly, the way a ghost might overlap with a room. You couldn't point to a single thing and call it proof, but the cumulative weight of the coincidences stopped feeling like coincidences somewhere around the 3rd or 4th. A woman named Jessie Tran had disappeared from a rest stop off Interstate 77 7 years earlier. She was 25, a graduate student, and her car had been found in the lot with the engine still running. Nathan's company ran a distribution route along the I-77 corridor, and his work travel log showed he had made a stop at a distribution hub 12 miles from that rest stop the morning before Jessie disappeared. A woman named Brianna Okafor had vanished from a suburb called Linden Falls 5 years ago. Nathan had attended a regional logistics conference in Linden Falls 3 weeks before she disappeared, and his phone GPS placed him in the area twice in the month prior to her disappearance. A third woman, Dawn Paletti, had gone missing from a campsite near Lake Carver 4 years earlier. Nathan's brother-in-law owned a cabin 2 miles from that campsite, and Nathan had borrowed the cabin, according to a text message recovered from the brother-in-law's phone the weekend before Dawn vanished. Alone, each data point was explainable. Together, they formed something that none of the investigators on the task force could look at without feeling physically uneasy. Detective Santos, who spent 3 weeks doing nothing but mapping the timeline overlaps, described the experience in a later interview. She said the thing that kept striking her was how geographically patient Nathan had been. He never operated in the same area twice in close succession. He varied the counties, the circumstances, the types of locations. It was as if he understood, intuitively, that patterns were what got people caught, and so he had deliberately made himself as patternless as possible, except for the one pattern he couldn't seem to stop, showing up at the searches. That was the tell. That was the one compulsion he could not discipline himself out of. Whatever need it served, control, proximity, the specific satisfaction of being thanked for looking for someone he had taken, he kept returning to it. Across 6 years, across multiple jurisdictions, across cases that no one had yet connected to each other, Nathan Mercer kept showing up to help look. In the meantime, the public image of Nathan Mercer in Millhaven was fracturing. When local media reported that a neighbor had been questioned and was now the subject of a warrant for his phone and digital devices, the community's reaction was visceral and divided. The Millhaven Next Door app became a battleground. People who had known Nathan for years, who had eaten at his table, whose kids had played soccer with his daughters, who had borrowed his snow blower or accepted his help moving furniture, refused to accept what they were hearing. One neighbor, A man named Tom Briggs, who had lived across the street from the Mercers for 6 years, told a local reporter, "This is insane. Nathan is one of the best people on this street. He organized our block's food drive 3 years running. He coached my son's soccer team. If you want to find out what happened to Emily, you should be looking somewhere else, because this isn't the guy." Nathan's wife, Diane, gave a brief statement from the front porch of their home. She was composed, pointedly, deliberately composed, and she looked directly into the camera and said, "My husband is a good man. He is a gentle, devoted man and a wonderful father. I know him. I know his character. And I know, in my heart, that he had nothing to do with what happened to Emily." She meant it. That was the thing that made the statement so hard to watch, in retrospect. Diane Mercer was not performing loyalty for the cameras. She genuinely, completely, believed what she was saying. Which meant that whatever Nathan Mercer had constructed inside that house, inside that marriage, inside that carefully maintained life, he had built it with enough integrity and consistency that the woman who knew him best had seen none of it. That detail, more than almost any other, haunted the investigators. The digital forensics team worked through Nathan's devices for 11 days before presenting their findings to the task force. What they found on those devices was not the careless data trail of someone who hadn't thought about consequences. It was something more sophisticated and, in its own way, more disturbing. Nathan had been monitoring local police scanner apps for years, not just in Millhaven, but in 3 surrounding counties. He had notification alerts configured for missing persons dispatches, search and rescue calls, and law enforcement activity in areas near where investigators now believed other victims had disappeared. He had saved audio recordings of police dispatches related to multiple cases, organized by date, stored in a folder on his laptop labeled Regional Safety Monitoring. He had downloaded and archived hundreds of news articles about missing women over the course of 7 years. They were stored in a nested folder system with titles that sounded institutional: community resources, local awareness, missing persons coverage. Nothing that would raise a flag if someone glanced at it. Everything organized, everything labeled, everything designed to look like the digital archive of a concerned community member rather than what it actually was. And then there were the journals. The journals were the thing that stayed with every investigator who read them. They were stored on a secondary hard drive, an external device that forensic technicians found taped to the inside of a removable panel in the closet of Nathan's home office. The journals spanned 6 years. They were password protected with a 20-character alphanumeric string. They were not, as investigators initially prepared themselves to encounter, explicit accounts of what Nathan had done to the women he had taken. They were something more methodical and, in the specific way that truly premeditated behavior is always more disturbing than impulsive violence, more revealing. They were records of social engineering. Nathan had used them to document what worked and what didn't, which behaviors generated trust quickly, which phrases prompted people to open up, which gestures signaled that a person was safe to confide in. He wrote about the specific value of volunteering in crisis situations, how it positioned you as a protector, gave you access to information about the investigation's progress, and generated a kind of social armor that was almost impossible to penetrate because no one wants to believe that the person standing beside them at a vigil, weeping, is the reason the vigil is happening. He wrote about attending memorials, about the families of missing women, how grief made them open in ways that normal people weren't, how a man who showed up consistently and expressed concern and offered practical help became someone those families trusted implicitly and would tell things to. Details about the investigation, theories about what had happened, information about what police had and hadn't found, that they wouldn't share with strangers. One entry, written 3 years before Emily's disappearance and dated on a Sunday evening like a diary entry from someone's ordinary weekend, read, "People tell you everything when you become the helper. The helper is never the one they're looking for." Detective Callahan read that line and put the printed transcript down on his desk. He stood up and walked to the window of his office and stood there for a long time without speaking. Santos, who was in the room, said she watched him stand there for almost 2 minutes and didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. Nathan Mercer was arrested on a Thursday morning, 5 weeks after Emily's disappearance, at his home on Cedarwood Lane. He was walked out in handcuffs past a small crowd of neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalk, some of them there out of shock, some out of grief. A few out of the bleak need to see it with their own eyes. Nathan walked to the patrol car with his head slightly bowed. He did not struggle. He did not speak. He glanced once at the gathered crowd, a brief, sweeping look that one neighbor later described as like he was checking who was there, and then got into the car. The first interrogation session began that afternoon and lasted 4 hours. Callahan led. Santos was present. A forensic psychologist named Dr. Anika Rowe observed via monitor from an adjacent room and took detailed notes. What Dr. Rowe observed and documented over the course of 3 interrogation sessions was, she would testify at trial, a near-textbook demonstration of what she called calculated effect management in a psychopathic personality structure. Nathan was pleasant throughout, reasonable sounding, patient. He never raised his voice. When presented with evidence, the GPS data, the pharmacy timeline contradictions, the enhanced Harwick footage, the digital forensics report, he responded not with denial or emotional collapse, but with quiet, methodical reframing. The GPS data must have recorded incorrectly. He'd heard those apps had issues. His presence in the Harwick footage was a coincidence. He had a friend in the area who he'd visited that week. The journals were personal notes on social dynamics, something he found intellectually interesting. He'd studied psychology briefly in college. The police scanner monitoring was simply a habit he'd developed after a friend's neighborhood had experienced a series of break-ins years ago. He answered every question. He just never answered any of them honestly. The break came during the second session, in a moment no one had planned for and no one forgot. Callahan had decided, on an instinct, not as a formal strategy, to play a clip from a television segment. It was an interview that Emily's mother, Linda Vaughn, had given the previous week. Linda sat in her living room, in front of a framed photograph of Emily taken at a family wedding 2 summers before, and she spoke with the particular steadiness of someone who is holding themselves together by force of will. She said she wanted whoever was responsible to understand that Emily was not invisible, that she was loved by people who would spend the rest of their lives missing her, that the family would not stop until they had answers. She was going to be somebody's mom someday, Linda said. She talked about it. She wanted 3 kids. She'd already picked out names. Her voice stayed level through all of it. I just want to know she's at peace. I just want to bring her home. The clip was 91 seconds long. Nathan Mercer watched it. His posture did not change. His hands, folded on the table in front of him, remained still. But something in his face moved, something underneath the surface of his expression, quick and unmistakable, like a shadow crossing water. It was not grief. It was not remorse. It was anger. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then it was gone, replaced again by the smooth, calibrated neutrality he had maintained throughout. But everyone in the room had felt it. Then, very quietly, almost to himself, Nathan said, "She made everything worse." Callahan leaned forward very slowly. "Who did?" Nathan looked at him. Something shifted in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, that he had just given something away. He said nothing more, but he had already said enough. The investigation had been building toward a theory about Emily, about why she had been taken, why she had seemed frightened at the bar, what she had been texting about in those final hours. Nathan's 4-second slip confirmed it completely. Emily Vaughn had not been a planned target. She had not been selected and watched and chosen the way investigators now believed Nathan had chosen other victims. She had been a problem. Specifically, she had been a witness, someone who had seen or found something that connected Nathan to a previous case, who had recognized what it meant, and who had been moving, carefully and responsibly, toward reporting it. Her phone, recovered weeks later from a drainage ditch 11 miles from Millhaven, submerged in a sealed plastic bag, contained the evidence. A series of text messages between Emily and her college friend Tara Osei, beginning 4 days before Emily's disappearance and ending with a message sent at 9:47 p.m. on the night she vanished. Emily had been asking Tara about Carla Simmons. the missing nurse from Harwick. She had been asking how to report a tip anonymously to law enforcement. She had been asking what you were supposed to do when you thought you knew something but weren't completely certain and didn't want to make accusations you couldn't substantiate. 2 days before she disappeared, she had written, "I think my neighbor knows something about that woman who went missing in Harwick 6 years ago. I found something. I don't know how to explain it in a way that makes sense yet, but I'm going to go to the police." Tara had written back immediately, urgently, "Emily, go now. Don't wait. Go today." Emily's response, sent the following morning, "I will. I just need one more day to make sure I'm not wrong. I don't want to ruin someone's life if I'm wrong." She was not wrong, and she never got her one more day. What Emily had found was never conclusively established. Investigators believe she encountered physical evidence somewhere near the shared boundary of Nathan's property and the wooded area behind Cedarwood Lane, something she saw or stumbled across during an evening walk that she had initially filed away as strange and only later, in the context of reading about the Carla Simmons case, understood. Nathan became aware that she knew, possibly because he saw her near his property, possibly through some other means the investigation was never able to fully reconstruct. And that awareness is what drove him to pull over on the corner of Grover and Elm at 11:52 p.m. when he saw his neighbor walking alone in the dark. She got in the car because she knew him, because he was a neighbor, because he had stood at her block's cookout and been pleasant and ordinary and completely, convincingly, safe. Search warrants executed on a hunting property that had belonged to Nathan's deceased uncle, a remote stretch of wooded land 2 hours from Millhaven that Nathan had quietly maintained access to for years through an informal arrangement with the estate, produced the physical evidence that finally, irrevocably, broke the case open. The search lasted 11 days. Investigators found personal belongings tied to multiple missing women, jewelry, a wallet, outdated mobile phones, and 6 identification cards belonging to women already in the cold case database. Faced with evidence he could no longer maneuver around, Nathan Mercer, during a third formal session conducted in the presence of his attorney, began disclosing burial locations. Not emotionally, not with remorse. He gave the information the way he gave everything, methodically, correcting himself occasionally for precision, as though accuracy mattered to him even now. For families received answers they had been waiting years for. Emily was found last. The recovery of Emily Vaughn's remains took place on a Tuesday morning in December, in a wooded area 18 miles from Millhaven. Her mother, Linda, was nearby, not at the recovery site itself, but in a car at the edge of the access road, accompanied by a victim's advocate and a grief counselor, watching through the bare winter trees as investigators moved carefully through the underbrush. There was no dramatic music in that moment, no catharsis, no release. Just a woman in a car in the cold, and the quiet sounds of people doing a difficult job with care, and the specific, terrible quality of waiting for something you already know is coming. What Linda Vaughn said afterward, quietly, to her victim's advocate, not to any camera, was this: she tried to do the right thing. She was careful. She was responsible. She just needed one more day. Nathan Mercer was convicted on 4 counts of murder in the first degree, with additional charges pending across 2 neighboring jurisdictions. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Diane Mercer did not attend a single day of it. She had filed for divorce within a month of Nathan's arrest, relocated with her daughters, and has not spoken publicly since. The families of the other victims sat in that courtroom for 6 weeks and listened to the full account of what Nathan Mercer had done and how long he had done it, and how many times the system had failed to connect the threads. Jessie Tran's mother sat in the front row every single day. She brought a photograph of Jessie and set it on the bench beside her, face up, every morning when court began. Brianna Okafor's sister flew in from out of state and gave a victim impact statement so precise and controlled and devastating that the courtroom was completely silent for almost 30 seconds after she finished and sat down. Carla Simmons had no surviving immediate family. A former colleague of hers from the hospital where she had worked, a woman who had known her for 4 years and had never stopped thinking about her, read a statement on her behalf. She described Carla as someone who had wanted to specialize in pediatric care, who had been saving up to take a certification course, who had a cat named Harold that she'd adopted from a shelter and absolutely doted on. She said, Carla wanted to spend her life making sick children feel less scared. That is who Nathan Mercer took from this world. Dr. Aniko Rowe, the forensic psychologist, testified that Nathan had constructed his entire identity around the performance of trustworthiness, not cynically, as a mask worn over something he knew was wrong, but as a genuine operating strategy that he had refined over years into something almost indistinguishable from character. He experienced satisfaction, she said, when the strategy worked. He experienced rage when it was disrupted. Emily Vaughn had disrupted it. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. The verdict was unanimous on all counts. After sentencing, Detective Callahan stood on the courthouse steps looking like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was only now being allowed to set it down. He gave a brief statement. Throughout this investigation, he said, one thing was consistently clear. Nathan Mercer's greatest asset was not intelligence. It was not planning, though the planning was extensive. It was the community's unwillingness to believe that someone who appeared that good, that helpful, that present, that trustworthy, could be responsible for something this terrible. He understood that unwillingness and he exploited it for years. He paused for a moment. Emily Vaughn figured it out. She was a dental assistant who lived 4 houses away from him, and she figured out what trained investigators had missed. She was careful about coming forward because she didn't want to hurt someone who might be innocent. She wanted one more day, and we know that she was on her way to us. He folded his notes. The least we can do, he said, is make sure her name is remembered for the right reasons. Millhaven has not recovered entirely. Communities rarely do, after learning something about themselves that cannot be unlearned. The neighbors who defended Nathan in the early days still live on the same streets as the people who lost someone, in a suburb that now understands, at a bone-deep, permanent level, that the most dangerous people are not always the ones who look dangerous. Marcus Webb, the bartender, still works at the tap room. He gave one interview after the verdict and has not given another. He said he noticed Emily that night and kept making drinks. He said he didn't know if going over to her would have changed anything. He said he thought about it and that he expected he would keep thinking about it for a long time. Tara Osei, Emily's college friend, the one who told her to go to the police immediately, who spent the 14 months of the investigation reliving those text messages over and over, has become an advocate for anonymous tip systems that are faster and more accessible. Emily was being careful, Tara says. Emily was being responsible. Emily was doing everything right. The system she was trying to access failed to make itself easy enough to reach in time. There is a bench in Riverside Park now, at the edge of the walking path near the pond where Emily used to run on Sunday mornings. The plaque on the back reads, Emily Vaughn. She noticed. She cared. She tried. For nearly a decade, Nathan Mercer stood at the edges of the grief he had created. He held flashlights at search parties. He shook detectives' hands. He sat at vigils for his victims and, by multiple accounts, wept. He handed out flyers bearing the faces of women he had taken and called out their names in the dark. He made himself indispensable to the very process of looking for them. And for years, for a devastating, unconscionable number of years, it worked. Because the most dangerous thing Nathan Mercer had ever understood was the thing he wrote about in his journals in plain, cold language. The helper is never the one they're looking for. The person beside you with the flashlight is the last person you suspect of being the reason you need it. Emily Vaughn was 26 years old. She loved her mother and texted her every night. She grew tomatoes in a garden she was quietly proud of. She sent handwritten birthday cards and remembered people's coffee orders and, for days before she disappeared, noticed something that nobody else had noticed in nearly a decade of searching, and she started quietly, carefully, responsibly doing something about it. She was the last person seen with Nathan Mercer. She was also the person who finally, irrevocably, stopped him. And that is the thing about Emily Vaughn that no verdict, no sentencing, no memorial bench can fully contain. She was trying to save someone, not herself. She didn't know she was in danger. She was trying to get justice for a woman she had never met, a nurse named Carla who disappeared 6 years before Emily ever moved to Millhaven. She just needed one more day. If this story stayed with you, and we believe it should, please take a moment right now to like this video. Leave a comment below and tell us what moment hit you the hardest. Was it the journals? The 7 seconds of silence? Linda Vaughn waiting in the car in December? These stories don't fade when we talk about them. They fade when we go quiet. Hit subscribe if you aren't already with us, because we tell stories like this every single week, with the seriousness, the care, and the respect that the people at the center of them deserve. Emily Vaughn deserved one more day. The very least we can do is make sure she is never forgotten.